Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to this Elections Monitor on the French election and the implications for the EU. I'm Sophie Pornschlegel. I'm a senior policy analyst with the European Policy Center, also working on French and German relations. So it's been 2 days that Emmanuel Macron has been re-elected as French president. He will start his new mandate of another 5 years, and he won against the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen, 58% against 41%, which is a 17% difference, which is still less than 2017, but still quite a margin. There is still a third election round coming up with the legislative elections in June, which will be extremely interesting. Parties are currently negotiating to see what kind of lists they will make, and hopefully he will have a majority to be able to continue to govern. Otherwise, there might be a cohabitation, so prime minister from another party. So the question is now, what does this mean for Europe? We know that Emmanuel Macron was a rather pro-European president that had his Sorbonne speech in 2017, where he really outlined his European policies. And now is the question of what can we expect from Emmanuel Macron in the second mandate? And to discuss exactly this issue, we have two speakers with us. One of them is still not there, but she will join shortly, I hope. But we still have Christine Ockrent, who is a journalist and producer of the broadcast Affaires étrangères in France Culture. She knows French domestic politics very well, but she also knows Brussels quite well. So she will be able to let us know what we can expect from Macron in this second mandate. So as we wait for Georgina, maybe what you can do, Mrs. Ockrent, is to let us know what you expect from Emmanuel Macron from his second mandate. Will he focus as much on EU policy as he did in the first mandate, or do you think he will focus more on domestic policies, especially as in the campaign cost of living was a huge issue, the pension reform? So will he have the leverage to really focus on foreign affairs and on EU policy?
Well, thank you, Sophie, and hello to all. Before getting into Macron's European policies and politics, let me just first stress the fact that he won. And that's quite remarkable because in our system, it's the first time a president gets re-elected in 20 years. Of course, his predecessors, not François Hollande, who simply didn't run, but of course, Nicolas Sarkozy very much wanted to be elected again. So same with Giscard d'Estaing, and it's only Mitterrand and Chirac who managed to get re-elected, but they were in what we call cohabitation. That's to say, they had actually a prime minister and a government from the opposition. So it's quite a remarkable achievement, the more so as the campaign, the presidential campaign in France has been riddled with all sorts of criticisms. Macron's contenders and most commentators would say, look at Macron. First of all, he doesn't even bother to campaign, busy as he was with Ukraine and of course the rotating presidency of the European Council. Eventually, he had to dive into the campaign between the second rounds, and the score is quite remarkable after 5 years and many crises, starting with Gilets jaunes, and I'm sure we'll talk about that again, COVID, and Ukraine. So, of course, most commentators, and that it's very French, would, the moment the results were announced on Sunday night, started to say all the bad clouds, all the issues that would raise immediately. Well, let's first acknowledge that Macron won. Now, it's true, as you said, that Marine Le Pen has increased her percentage. It's interesting to try and understand why. On the first round of the elections on April 10th, the results showed the country really divided in 3 blocks. One block at the center, that's Macron, slightly higher, but not that much, than the 2 other blocks, one on the extreme right with Le Pen, but also one on the extreme left with Mélenchon. The problem with Mélenchon is that once he loses, he cries it's a scandal, and in fact he should have won. And since Sunday night, he and his supporters claim that he should actually become prime minister, which doesn't make any sense if one is interested in French institutions. But politically, it's a very smart move, because obviously there are pockets of anger, dissatisfaction, and actually the map of the results, when you look at the map of France, show indeed the divide even more than last time between the have and the have-nots, the urban areas with higher educated people, as opposed to decentralized areas with people who have a great deal of difficulty making ends meet, and especially now with inflation and the price of and the cost of gas and so on and so forth. And the problem of purchasing power, the cost of living, is precisely what Marine Le Pen very cleverly used to campaign. And she did so going to those areas where she got very high scores as a result. Now, Sophie, you said we'll have another round. That's true. We have parliamentary elections, and that is where traditional political parties hope to recover. Because when you look at what used to be French politics between, right and left, well, the right, the traditional conservatives, are in a very bad shape. Their candidate got only 4.8%, 4.8% for a party that had been in power, since World War II for quite a few years. And that party, most of these people really dislike one another intensely. So they find it very difficult to come to a common approach. How do we have to deal with Macron? But we do have these parliamentary elections, so we have a chance, because we have MPs with strong regional, local roots, so that may work. The problem is that they are split. Some of them have already joined Macron's party, others do not, and will probably eventually go closer to Le Pen. Then you have on the left, the Socialist Party is dead. Madame Hidalgo got exactly 1.7%. So the Socialist Party has no other choice but go under Jean-Luc Mélenchon's rule, which is not an easy thing for them to do, because Mélenchon has very strong positions, which are not at all those of the traditional social democrat parties all over Europe. He's against NATO, he's really quite against the EU. He did like Putin. Well, he was compelled to erase his leanings a little bit as of late. He's an intervention, he's a state, authoritarian champion. So he also has to try and accommodate the Greens. The Greens, who did not do very well in the presidential election, but for the younger generation, environment is, of course, a major issue. And Mélenchon turned into a very active and eloquent proponent of environment policies. So do I see Georgina? Has she?
Yes, exactly. I was going to say,
Maybe I'll stop here.
Yeah, maybe I'll stop here and we can come back to the implications for the EU. Thanks for this take, and especially mentioning also the different political leanings when it comes to the EU of the different parties, which will be important in the parliamentary elections. But welcome, Georgina, Georgina Wight, who is director of the Europe program at Institut Montaigne. Thanks for coming here, and we already started off, and I was asking Christine Ockrent her first take on these presidential elections. So maybe from your perspective, I know you are an expert also in French and British relations, so maybe what was your first take on this result?
Yeah, first, can you hear me, Sophie? Yes. Oh, thank goodness.
Very well.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and thank you to EPC for the invitation. And it is such an honour, particularly to speak alongside Christine Ockrent, who I've had the chance to be interviewed by, but haven't had the chance to speak next to you. So thank you very much. And I'm so sorry, my computer has decided this morning to give up on me. And so I had to run around the office, and I now have found a computer. So thank you very much. Anyway, so I think my first sort of takeaway from this campaign, I mean, I moved to Paris about 1.5 years ago, and I was so excited to be here during a presidential campaign. I was like, you know, having grown up in Brussels, France is, you know, the French take their presidential election so seriously. I remembered watching campaigns from very young, the big debates, and my first sort of takeaway is the lack of real campaigning, or the lack of feeling that there was really a presidential campaign happening in France. And I think that's partly also because the president himself, and we could come back to it maybe on why he decided to announce that he was running so late in the day, but he sort of waited until the last moment to say that he was running. And then, of course, with the war in Ukraine, understandably overshadowing much of the campaign, but also a sense that the 12 candidates who were running in parallel. They weren't really competing against each other. And so there were no issues really guiding this campaign at all. And so we got a sense from polling that purchasing power, that rising energy costs, that rising living costs were the key issues guiding this, but that actually there weren't really any issues structuring the campaign, unlike in 2017, where if you think of the centre-left candidate at the time, Benoît Hamon, who was talking about universal income, you had Marine Le Pen, who was talking about leaving the euro. This time around, it was more nebulous. So I think partly the war in Ukraine, partly the president deciding to run late, partly that all the candidates had different mandates and no real issues that they were promoting. So that's sort of my sense. And so the sort of the election campaign really galvanized between the first and the second round. And I think if you think of Emmanuel Macron, his challenge now, and Christine is absolutely right, because I got to listen to most of what she was saying, you know, the real campaign starts now, because he needs to make sure that he has a majority in Parliament to do at least most of the things that he'd like to do. But there was a real sense in the entre-deux tours that is when we were getting a sense of what we might expect from both candidates when they get in the second round. And what you had with Macron is he was very much defending his first mandate. He was obviously criticising and sort of breaking, or not criticising, but breaking down all of Marine Le Pen's proposals. But he didn't really give us much into what we could expect from a second mandate. So I think this is the question. And I know, Sophie, you wanted me to talk about the EU, and I'm sure we can come back to it, and probably a lot of questions that will interest many of your participants. But Europe will obviously continue to be a key and central pillar of his mandate.
Yeah, thanks, Georgina. I was just going to say, maybe we can go back, but I forgot some housekeeping rules because I was too busy jumping into the topic straight away. So, of course, there will be time for a Q&A. If you have your questions, we will be able to take them later on and before 3, of course. So please don't hesitate to ask your question in the Q&A box or to raise your hand so we can take you on. Maybe to go back to what you just said, I know I want to jump straight into the EU because obviously it's quite important. I mean, we can't look in the crystal ball, but it's important to know what this means also for European affairs. We know that he's pro-European, but we don't know yet what the second mandate will look like. Can you maybe, and I'll start with Mrs. Ockrent again, tell us more about the role of the EU in this campaign? Because it's true that Macron, started quite late campaigning, but then between the 2 election rounds, it was a topic. It was also a topic in the debates with Marine Le Pen. Are we expecting, is it only because of Macron that we talk about the EU? Is it to be seen rather positively that, the EU is also becoming increasingly a domestic topic, or is it rather seen as a bad thing because it's very polarizing? So maybe.
Well, I think the campaign and the debate between the two main contenders and the results show that indeed Europe is now part of the French political landscape. Marine Le Pen was extremely careful not to touch upon any issue, any European issue, which might put her in discomfort. She doesn't talk about Brexit. She doesn't talk about getting out of the euro. But for whoever cared to read her program, it's all there. Because her idea was, and I guess still is, because she will keep running, that to ask the French through referendum what they really want. She wants national laws to take over European rules. So, you know, a whole set of tools which would have actually meant, like pretty much Orban, a sort of Hungarian-like position. Macron, Europe is in his DNA. It's something which has run throughout his first mandate. Sophie, you mentioned those two important speeches that he made. Of course, those speeches are always well welcome, you know, in other European circles, with the usual little smile about the French way to have those grandiose words. And, you know, what actually do we do? But it is true that through COVID, the French have come to realize that thanks to the government's handling and the EU, without the EU, they wouldn't have had vaccines. And that goes for many member states. And so the fact that Macron would keep insisting during the debate that indeed Europe is the sort of natural and framework of any project for France, that remains. What he will actually, what will be his margin of maneuver in the coming months, not to mention the coming years, well, you're right. It's obvious that domestic issues, and there again, the cost of living, how to avoid having another third or fourth tour, as we say, in the streets, with people rioting or expressing discontent in September, because before that we have parliamentary elections, then there's summer vacation, but September might be very rough in social terms. On his victory speech Sunday night, which was very sober, well, you did have Beethoven's symphony, which is, of course, it was less grandiose a setting than 5 years ago, but the touch was there, the intention was there. And the fact that Macron would say, well, in fact, I have to find other methods, I have to get more people involved. In other words, I have to have trade unions, other partners participate in the reforms that France still needs to proceed with. So yes, there will be priority on domestic issues, but you know, for any of our countries, domestic issues are so closely linked to what's happening on the European scene. And especially as far as Paris is concerned, to what extent does the agreement with Berlin about pursuing the same policies as was agreed upon in the summer of 2020? No.
Yes. NGU.
Yes. It's difficult with COVID, one gets mixed up with the calendar. So I think that's the key issue. And of course, as the tradition goes, Macron will go to Berlin in his first foreign visit as re-elected president.
I'll have to stop you there before you answer all the questions that I had noted down, because this is exactly what I wanted to get into. But it's good because this is exactly what I was expecting to hear, or hoping to hear, as an analysis, especially looking at how much margin of maneuver he will have. I think that's an interesting point. Also knowing that he won't be re-elected a third time, so maybe this will also give him a little bit of freedom, but who knows. Georgina, maybe first looking back at the campaign, I mean, you started mentioning, that it was a very short campaign, at least for Macron, that now is the real campaign phase. What role did the EU play? And do you think this will also have an impact on his next mandate, this campaign?
So it's a really good question, because in his first rally, which, as I said, came quite late, he barely mentioned the EU. He talked about everything else. He talked about energy, he talked about purchasing power, he talked about what he'd done to try and bring society together. But actually at his rally, he didn't really talk about the EU. But in the sense, the EU was sort of across everything, and it came out very strongly in the Grand Débat. But I think the main difference between Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron is whether they see the EU as part of the solution to many of the problems that French citizens face, or whether they see it as more of a hindrance. And so, of course, Macron was advocating for more Europe as a solution, and we should be focusing on making the EU more powerful, and that France has a huge role in shaping that Europe. And versus Marine Le Pen, who said, actually, the EU integration has gone too far, it's acting as a hindrance, and we need to return, as Christine was saying, we need to return powers back to the national level. And so, in a sense, even though he perhaps didn't speak as much about the EU as many of his supporters would have liked, it very much was across everything that he was saying. And I think this is really interesting when we think about what he's going to try and achieve in the second mandate. So as you talked about, Sophie, his speech that he gave at the Sorbonne in 2017, I mean, for him, it was absolutely clear that a strong and global Europe makes for a strong and global France. He sees them as interlinked, and his Sorbonne speech presented sort of 6 key priority areas. So security and defense, migration and borders, climate and environment, digital, food security and sovereignty, and economic and industrial power. And if you think of all of those 6, basically the EU's been talking about them for the past 5 years. And, France has taken over, as all these people connected to the goal will know, the presidency of the Council in January. Over 250 texts being discussed inside the Council, the grouping of the 27 countries. For most of them, France had been the kind of key motor behind many of those texts. So he has really managed to get the EU to talk about these issues. The difficulty now is what does he want to do next? And I suspect that he'll want to go further and faster than he has over the past 5 years. He'll want to tackle those very tricky discussions like Eurozone reform, Schengen reform. He's already talked about forming a kind of political grouping that could talk about the difficulties of freedom of movement and how you can strengthen borders. Those are tricky discussions, and I think he will want to push for those. Of course, that goes with, you can't do that without Germany. So Christine's absolutely right. The Franco-German relationship, which, they have a level of trust, which I think is fairly unprecedented, but they don't always agree. And there are key issues now that are really dividing them. And that's going to have to be a key area of concern, because it's not that you need them to agree on everything, but if you want to move and if you want to do what Macron has set out, which is so many proposals, so many things, he really needs to get Germany on board for most of them. So I think Germany would be the priority, continuing to invest in other bilateral relationships. So Christine talked about, the Netherlands, but also Spain, Italy. I thought Prime Minister Draghi's sort of, welcome speech following Emmanuel Macron's re-election was quite interesting. And I think Macron will want to continue investing in those relationships and also with the key institutions, but further and faster. And I think if he feels that the EU 27 cannot progress on certain things, he might start pushing smaller, flexible formats. So you've heard a little bit of this core and then concentric circles. I think the ambition for France is for everyone to move together. But in a sense, I think there will be an openness to say, well, if it doesn't work, what can we do differently? And I suspect there will be more on that as well. But we can expect a president who remains engaged, who has lots of ideas. His challenge will be to get others to follow him.
Thanks, Georgina. You said a lot of things that I will take up now on my next question. As you know, my French-German relations are my favorite topic, so I'll go back into that. You mentioned that he wants an ambitious agenda. I think Germany has been known to follow a strategy of inclusion instead of ambition, of trying to find the lowest common denominator to make sure that everyone's there. So I'm just wondering, how do you see the Franco-German relation evolve? And that was also one of the questions of the participants, Kevin Leiden. Is this going to move forward? How is it going to move forward? And I link it to another question that was also asked by one of the participants, Heidi Hanilla, who asked whether France is for an oil and gas embargo in Russia, knowing that this discussion has been extremely difficult in Germany, that they're not particularly keen on this. So do you expect to have more divergences between the two big countries of the EU or not? And I'll start straight with you, Georgina, and then I'll go back to Mrs. Ockrent.
Great. So on the first question, I mean, I've heard from multiple people that there were sort of 10 big points of disagreement. I didn't get much kind of elaboration on what those were, but we can imagine that one of them, for example, could be nuclear, where, you know, France and Germany differ on the role of nuclear and the role of nuclear and energy security as well. I suspect that they differ on the revision of the Eurozone and the Growth and Stability Pact. I mean, I think it was quite interesting when the German government was formed and Christian Lindner said, you know, of course, we're open to a discussion. Now, of course, in France, that was immediately seized upon as that's it. We're going to revise the rules, and then there was a kind of correction from Germany that was like, no, we're going to discuss them, potentially simplifying the rules, but not complete revision. But those are like two that, you know, stick out like a sore thumb for me in where they disagree. But as I said, they have a level of mutual trust. I mean, these governments talk at the highest political level frequently, but also all across government several times a week. I mean, there is this just level of deep trust, of deep dialogue, and there is a sense as an outside, you know, as a Brit and European in Paris who looks at this relationship, I have a sense that they can speak freely when they disagree. They know where they disagree. And they can have a frank conversation. And so the question is, how can you now move from that to concrete solutions? On the embargo, my sense is that France is probably favourable to an embargo, but feels that this is, you know, understands that this is a very tricky decision for Germany, that this isn't just about a hit on GDP, this is a hit on industry and, you know, Germany being the big economic powerhouse inside the EU, and that this is a complicated decision and that there is a sense from the German government that they need to think about strategic planning. So they've done a lot on decarbonisation, and so there needs to be a plan. And I think, I mean, I suspect, I don't know, that these will be one of the issues that Macron talks to Scholz about. And my sense is France will not come out and openly disagree with Germany. The attempt will first to try and talk to Germany, you know, behind closed doors, try and find a way within the EU Council, because it's not just, you know, bilateral talks between the two of them, it's also within the EU, to really see how they can, you know, accelerate the decarbonisation agenda, and also potentially explore sanctions that could go as far as an embargo, but in a way that sort of the EU feels comfortable with.
Yeah, thanks, Georgina. Maybe just one point to add also to Mrs. Ockrent. There was quite a lot of anti-German sentiment, especially coming from Marine Le Pen in this campaign. Do you think this will affect also Macron's, you know, Europe policy or his relationship to Germany, knowing that apparently a lot of French citizens seem to have resentments against Germany as being the bigger, powerful neighbor in a way?
I wouldn't say so. It's I mean, that was Le Pen. She's been defeated, even though, again, her score was very high. So I don't think that interferes in any form or fashion. To answer your first question, and just to complement what Georgina said, I think a lot depends on what's happening with the German coalition. It's not that simple, it seems. And again, Chancellor Scholz does not see, as seen from Paris, doesn't seem as of now yet into a sort of a fully fledged, self-assured chancellor, in fact, with his two other party members. And then there's something else that we haven't talked about yet, which is the war. The war in Ukraine is, I think, not only a horrid tragedy for the Ukrainians, but I think it is really an accelerator of Europe. Because whatever political differences, whatever different priorities from one member country to the other, it is obvious that we have to stick together. And it's quite remarkable that so far, at least, and even with the sort of gas blackmail that Russia is able to exercise, the 27 have stuck together. And even Mr. Orbán, by the way, although he was brilliantly re-elected in Hungary, must feel a little bit more lonely. Not only his friend Le Pen hasn't won, but look at what happened in Slovenia, which is very interesting, that the populist prime minister was defeated. And so, the Visegrad group is more or less broken because Poland and Hungary now don't quite agree with each other. So there are different patterns within the EU. And Georgina was quite right to stress upon the fact that Mario Draghi and Macron have obviously a very close relationship, which is important because Draghi does enjoy his reputation as a former president of a central bank. And when it comes to deciding in the next few months whether we should all go back to the Maastricht rules or whether we should continue after the quite radical change that COVID imposed upon us, very much to the benefit of our economies, that will be, I think, an important partnership that will decide or that will influence the course of events.
Thank you. And there are so many questions already, so I'm trying to look at how I'll do the course of this event. But I think I want to go back to what you just said about his role in the war and in particular economic policy, because I think that's something that has been discussed on the sidelines of course, the whole defense and foreign policy agenda. But I think there is also a perspective thing between Brussels and other member states that can perceive France as being protectionist or trying to, reflect French interests in Europe much more. So maybe if you could discuss on the SGP reform, on, the industrial and the tech agenda, do you expect Macron to still want to play such a leadership role in the EU and to try to bring forward French interests, or will he have more of a compromise-seeking role in the coming years to come? So I don't know who wants to go first, but
just a quick answer to that one, Sophie. As you know Germany very well, the feeling we have in Paris is that if there's one member state which, for all sorts of serious reasons, has always put its commercial interests before anything else, that's Germany. France, in a way, would wish to have that many, so many assets to fight for. But I think each country is fighting, for the best of its own interests. There's nothing new there, and I don't believe it's quite a French specialty, but it will be interesting on all environmental issues to see whether indeed all the promises that Macron made in order to get re-elected on the French scene, he will try and influence our partners to indeed increase or accelerate their own programs in the same direction.
Fully agree with that. Maybe Georgina, and also on the you know, the discussion about Recovery Fund 2.0, do you see Macron pushing for this and for SGP reform in particular?
So the easy question, well, the easy answer would be not immediately, because obviously he's going to be very much in campaign mode, even though, you know, the parliamentary elections are separate. He's going to try and sort of galvanize that election, because it's going to be important for him to do all the necessary reforms domestically, by the way, which it's not just about what the EU does, it's also about what France does. And I think there is a realization in Paris that, you know, France is often criticized for the protectionist interest, even though Christine's absolutely right, sometimes Paris perceives, you know, Germany perhaps as being more openly or covertly promoting commercial interests. But yes, you know, it knows that it's being criticised for the protectionist angle, and it knows also that, you know, one of the criticisms, particularly from frugal countries, is, well, how can we be talking about mass investment and then taking on more debt when you cannot seem to get your deficit under control? And so these are really important. France is committed to a number of important reforms, you know, through its national plan to access the next generation EU fund, so the pensions, you know, reforms, and which he was tackled on by Marine Le Pen during the Grand Débat. But there are a number of other important reforms that he needs to pass, and that happens at the domestic level. So I think that that's going to matter. On, you know, his whole, is it protectionist or is it not? I mean, I think for France, there are two things. One, it's an imperative, because COVID has shown the supply chains, global supply chains aren't that resilient. They can be really tested, and in times of crisis, you can, you know, you can find yourself cut off or lacking strategic you know, metals and things to produce, or simply that Europe isn't in no way able to produce some of the things that it needs. So it's an imperative to be able to produce. And the second, it's also a strength, because I think the view in press is we should be thinking, you know, 2030, 2040, we're going to have the United States, China that is much more powerful. Where does Europe sit? What is it going to, you know, how can Europe remain competitive on the global stage? And how can it remain sovereign? And how can it ensure that it sets the rules that apply to it? And so in a sense, that's the whole of Macron's Versailles agenda, which was, let's think about where Europe is competitive. How can we continue to support that industry? And then what structural, you know, what investment do we need? Is it public, private? Is it a combination of both? And what structural changes or what changes to the EU rules do we need? And so that's particularly the Growth and Stability Pact, where, you know, Bruno Le Maire famously in January said the problem with the Growth and Stability Pact is with more focused on stability and not enough on growth. And so the sense is, what investment do we need? You know, let's identify where we're competitive and strategically competitive. What investment do we need, and what rules do we change? And then viewed from that perspective, it isn't, you know, it isn't protectionist. It's very much in a sort, but I will let others decide whether that is in some way a hidden protectionist agenda or not.
I was just teasing and maybe portraying the German position. Maybe just also to remember that there will be European elections in 2024, so there will also be a change of guard in Brussels. I would like to take a few questions because I see them coming in and they are extremely interesting. So maybe I would ask John Palmer to come in and ask his question about the French Council presidency. If you can hear us, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Fascinating discussion. I would like to put what I know is a difficult question, because the political geography of Europe is still settling down in the context of the war and so on. But I wondered how ambitious for the Convention on the Future of Europe the French presidency is now prepared to be. There are many people who believe that it's time to tackle some of the most fundamental questions about how we move to more effective governance at a European level. So what kind of horizons do you think the presidency will set, and how quickly, in terms of the timing, on issues such as treaty changes? And what kind of priority areas would you envisage, or would the French presidency envisage, for potential treaty changes?
Thank you very much. That's a $1 million question. I would take on 2 more questions and then we can have a round. And I would ask Gabriela Kovac to ask her question if she's there. Yes.
Hello, good afternoon. My question is related to bilateral cooperation between France and Hungary after the elections in terms of the cooperation in the field of nuclear energy as a solution, as a hook for reaching the Green Deal target. Thank you.
Thank you. A very important question as well. And the last one is from Pierre-Olivier Bergeron, who is asking also a very interesting question. Can you hear us? I think you need to unmute yourself to ask your question.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Thank you very much. A question to Mrs. Ockrent, and thank you for this very interesting program. Now that President Macron has literally dismantled traditional parties, what can he do to ensure that the extreme right will not succeed his presidency in 5 years' time?
Thanks. So quite a domestic policy question on looking forward in 5 years' time. Wonderful. So if Mrs. Ockrent, you want to start off with one of the questions, you have a wide choice. So please go ahead.
Well, okay, let me try and answer to the last question. It's a very difficult one to answer because a lot of criticism already applies to the past 5 years. How come Emmanuel Macron has not been able to prevent not only the extreme right, but the extreme left to gain so much success? My answer would be that yes, he has in a way so well succeeded in destroying the usual political landscape that he feels somehow immersed in its ashes. But you could also put the same question to traditional political parties. How come French conservatives who've been in power, for so many years, how come they have let the far right win so much ground? And I would put, of course, the same blame on the French socialists, who are the first responsible for what is actually a kind of suicide. And they were in power 5.5 years ago with Hollande. How come they have let themselves in a way which is, a very bad omen for social democracy as a system, which is in many of our member states a sort of common political affiliation. How come those two political parties have failed to such an extent? So maybe I'll stop there to let Georgina handle the real difficult questions.
Thank you very much. If I can maybe just add a quick point on because I think the last question from Pierre-Olivier is really important. My observation as an outsider is how personified the presidential election has become. It appears to be very much centered around the candidate and not so much about their party. I mean, even Jean-Luc Mélenchon in 2017, it was about La France Insoumise, it was about the movement. Now it was more about him, actually. And I had a debate with one of his MPs who disagreed profoundly with that statement. But there was a sense even, and this is anecdotal and certainly not based on significant data, but I was walking past a cafe in Paris and someone said, but the problem with Jean-Luc Mélenchon is he's made it all about him. And so I thought that is quite an interesting take, and I tested it with a couple of people. So how personified the presidential election has become, but parties still very much matter in regional and local elections, and potentially also for the parliamentary elections. So I think we shouldn't discount straight away the centre left or the centre right.
Georgina, maybe just to come in before you answer the two other questions, because I saw that there is a question that fits quite well with that question. if he doesn't manage to have an absolute majority in the parliamentary elections, what kind of coalitions do you think would work out? Is it more of a, because I know that in the first mandate he was seen as more of a center-right politician, so what do you think would be the preferred option for Macron in that case?
I mean, I suspect it sort of depends on who can be his greatest ally, because it's not just about securing a majority, it's about securing a majority that works, right? If you had a Jean-Luc Mélenchon prime minister, that would be it would be it would be more difficult for Macron to enact a lot of his, at least domestic reforms. And this is the big question that everyone has, and maybe Christine has a better answer to this as to who will he try and kind of attract. And in a way, I thought Jean-Luc Mélenchon sort of talking straight after Marine Le Pen and saying, this is the worst elected president in the Fifth Republic, and now the campaigning starts, and now you have to elect me prime minister. I mean, I think this is making Macron think about where he's going to try and attract those votes. Is it by presenting a more left-wing proposal, so based around climate change and environment and that kind of stuff, or will it be more on sort of reforms and pension reforms and labour law reforms and supporting industry, which may be more appealing to the right? So it's not entirely clear, but Christine might have a view on that. And very quickly on the Rassemblement National and where will it go? I think Marine Le Pen has one victory under her belt, and it's that she's managed to make herself look much more like a centrist and moderate candidate, but also her party is much more centrist. Now, it's still seen as a party of, racist and dangerous for democracy, but that could change. And you can imagine creating a whole new party with much of the ideology, with a new head that could galvanize at the next election a much greater support base than she has.
Mrs. Ockrent, maybe you want to come in on what kind of options would be good for the parliamentary elections, knowing that they are still in negotiations, of course, and it's unclear who will, be in a coalition with whom.
Yeah, I think however brilliant Mélenchon can be with words, the idea that he could become prime minister is really far-fetched. That's not the way our institutions work. He will not run to become prime minister. It will all depend on the results of his party and other political parties, and their, having local roots. We will see center-right and center-left candidates probably manage more or less to keep some seats. The French National Assembly has 577 MPs. In the outgoing assembly, Mélenchon has 17 MPs, and Le Pen has 7 MPs. So you can imagine the kind of progress that those two parties will have to perform in order not even to mention a majority, but to have a really consistent opposition group. Of course, they will try and put candidates in many places where they wouldn't have dreamt of trying to get elected. But it's a long way, and I think that Macron will probably widen his government picks, more to center-right, which he already did, by the way, 5 years ago, picking up Edouard Philippe as prime minister. Edouard Philippe, who now has his own political party, very close to Macron, but still, Edouard Philippe is already running for the next presidential election, because that's the way our system works. And by the way, Georgina is right saying it's very personalized, but that's the way our institutions are. Sarkozy was a very personalized president. Hollande wanted to be just a simple guy. Well, that the French didn't like either. So we're always torn between wanting to have a monarch and then of course, not really liking him for being so Jupiterian or monarchian. So I think what Macron will try and do is show a sort of lifting, if you will, to have faces, new faces, younger faces, for both sides of the spectrum, not the extremes, of course, but to have people with very strong local and regional roots, and that will be interesting. There will be some women mayors that are being talked about to join the government. In that sense, it will be different.
And maybe just to add to that, the abstention rate was a big topic for the presidential election, which I think was not necessarily as bad as, you know, in the US comparatively, but in the parliamentary election, there is a very high abstention rate. So I think it will also depend on that, of course. I'm looking at the watch and we still have the 2 questions. So maybe, Georgina, you want to answer either the cooperation with Hungary on nuclear energy, whether you see this happening, or the big question on the conference on the future of Europe, especially as we know that Macron will hold a speech on the 9th of May, maybe also kind of looking more into what we can expect in EU policy.
So they're both excellent questions. On the Hungary, I probably don't have a satisfactory answer other than, you know, we know that political relations between the 2 heads of state is at times tense between Macron and Orban. And I think that if there is an attempt by France to constitute a sort of nuclear alliance, it would be an alliance rather than a sort of bilateral. But this is me off the top of my head rather than on the firm of any research. So we'll have to see. But I suspect that France will probably push the kind of, you know, several countries coming together, and a bit like the proposal we saw a couple of months ago with Finland and other nuclear countries coming together. On the conference, The Future of Europe, excellent question. I mean, very much a French initiative. The idea was to launch it during the German presidency, for it to culminate under the French presidency. And then, of course, because of COVID, it got delayed. And I think it probably hasn't had the reach that President Macron was hoping for. And the EPCs got together an observatory on the Conference of the Future of Europe, which is really interesting. And I highly encourage you to read some of the reports that have come out of that. But I think, what will Macron do? I mean, he's very much said from the beginning that he believes in change. He thinks change is necessary to make the EU more powerful. But that change cannot just come from the top. It needs to be supported from the bottom and you know, not only supported, but also influenced by what EU citizens deem as important and how they see the future of the EU evolving. So this is really important to him. We know that the report's going to be handed in May, and I suspect that's when the kind of big speech will coincide. I suspect he'll use that opportunity to remind citizens that they have a part in shaping the EU. But my understanding is there was no sort of willingness to straight away use that and say, well, this is what we're going to do. This report was going to be a basis on which EU governments would talk and discuss about what potential changes might come out of it, and then the European Parliament. And so changes were further down the line. And I understand, you know, from what I understand, France isn't really in favour of treaty change per se, not against it, but it's not their preferred course of action, because of course treaty change is a bit like opening Pandora's box, and you know, everyone's sort of haggling over things, and it might not be the best way to implement. So I think they're going to look at what EU citizens have proposed and then think of the best course of action. But I suspect they'll probably emphasise this coalitions, these flexible formats over treaty change. But, you know, Clément Beaune, France's EU secretary, wrote a very interesting piece when he was still Europe advisor to President Macron, talking about the presidency EU policy. And he made clear there, you know, we think the Commission should be smaller. We don't think everything should be qualified majority voting, but we're not against it. And on treaty change, he says we don't think that this is the first thing we should do, but we shouldn't discount it. So the en même temps philosophy of Macron, I think.
Thanks. I don't know, Mrs. Ockrent, if you have any comments, especially on the treaty changes on the conference, knowing that it was such a French idea, but it wasn't taken on that much, I feel, in the campaign either.
So just a word on treaty changes. I don't think there's any prime minister or president in the 27 area who wants to try and get into treaty changes because it's a murderous process, and we've seen ever since the last ones that indeed the best way is to try and get to some concrete goals by consensus. And what is very interesting, and Georgina mentioned it, is this idea, which is very much, I think, at the core of Macron's approach for the coming years, of finding consensus among the willings. You know, those countries which are really interested because it's a priority for them. Would it be Schengen and immigration? Would it be nuclear, in the environment, any other major issues? And so, yes, it will be interesting to see what comes out of the conference. And indeed, as all our governments have to face their own people sooner or later, these goals will have to be compatible with most people's priorities as they feel them right now. I think we should not forget the role that social media play in the way citizens are informed. We discussed the fact that there was no real debate in the French presidential campaign, at least before the first round. That's very much like social media, where people it's in silos. People stick to people who think the same, and they're not really interested in crisscrossing with people who disagree. And I think that's a dimension in contemporary politics, in our democracies, that we have very much to take into account.
Yeah, thank you. I think that was an extremely important point to make. Nevertheless, I would maybe add that the debate was seen as quite, a lot of content for a campaign, especially looking. I can only compare it to the German election, where you didn't have a almost 3-hour-long debate between two of the candidates. What I like to do right before saying thanks to everyone is kind of a final round, and it's a question to you that asks also for wishful thinking in a way. But if you were, let's say, Macron's advisor on EU policy, where do you think he should put his energy in? I know it's quite a broad question, but would you say a continuation of what he did on EU policy in the last 5 years is something good, or should he maybe change track a little bit? And I'll start with Georgina, and maybe keep your answers short if that's possible.
So I think that would probably require sort of like half an hour answer on analysing all the progress he's made. I mean, I think if you're objectively thinking that the EU isn't working quite the way it is and you want it to be reformed, then actually you'd probably commend President Macron for all of his ideas. I think if I were advising President Macron, I would say two things, not necessarily on le fond, so not on the substance, but on the form. He needs to get better at communicating to non-French audiences, because a lot of the time he says things, and then what you have are like Macron translators who are like, no, that's not what he said. Actually, he meant this. And I think just making sure that what he says is being perceived straight away, and that there isn't room for misinterpretation. And the second thing is not speak in the name of Europeans unless he's had the chance to discuss it first and have consensus, because there is, I think, I've detected a sometimes mild irritation from other member states who think that he has a tendency to speak in the name of Europeans without really consulting them first. So I think it would be more on the form and less on the substance.
Thanks. Mrs. Ockrent?
Well, very quickly, and of course too quickly, because it's an issue we haven't had time to touch upon. One of Macron's favorite projects is what is called strategic autonomy, which is one of those typical French expressions that's almost impossible to translate into any other language. I think that under the lessons of the war in Ukraine, I think Macron has gotten to the point where he understands that he cannot oppose his idea of European defense and NATO. And so my advice to him would be to insist, to work on the best way to try and articulate a European pillar within NATO, so as to take into account in the coming years what our European priorities might be, will be, and they may differ from American ones, North American ones, if you include Canadians or Indo-Pacific. And so I think that would be, I think, a very interesting and important piece of advice, if I may.
Yeah, thank you so much for the recommendations. I mean, I hope maybe someone listened, if not Macron's cabinet, then maybe a few Europeans working in the institutions who participated today. I apologize to all the people who asked questions I could not reply to. 1 hour is short, and I know we all have a lot to do. There's still a war going on. There are so many, I mean, we also were the Slovenian election, so I'm sure there's a lot of analysis and everyone has a lot to do at work. So thanks for taking the time, especially Georgina and Christine Ockrent, for giving your analysis today, even if it was short. I think it was extremely important. Thanks to the participants for taking the time, and of course to the team at the EPC for organizing, especially Nathalie, Clara, and also Johannes from the EPI team. We'll stay in touch. I'm sure we will discuss Franco-German relations and EU policy in the future. So I wish everyone a lovely afternoon and see you soon.